what happens is that when students are incentivized to this degree to perform something like that, that they start to believe it, that they feel like the difference between going to Harvard and going to, like, I don't know, a perfectly fine but not Harvard school is that they have to construct this type of identity around themselves. And that if, the way in which Harvard was doing it for a while is basically if you didn't write about it in your essay, it didn't count, right? Like, it didn't count that you were this minority group unless you, like, told a sob story about it. I find that to be, like, totally indefensible. Actually, I find it to be, like, quite disgusting, right? That this, like, elite institution is asking these kids to perform their trauma stories for them.
Hello, thanks for tuning in. This is The Glenn Show. I'm Glenn Loury. The Glenn Show is sponsored by the Manhattan Institute for Policy Research in New York City, where I'm John Paulson Senior Fellow. I'm also a professor at Brown University in the Economics Department and the Watson Center for International Affairs. I'm with J. Caspian Kang. Jay is a writer, a staff writer at The New Yorker, formerly staff writer at the New York Times magazine and the opinion page at the New York Times. And what else should we say about you, Jay? What are you up to?
I'm in Hawaii right now. I've been here for about a month visiting my sister. So I don't know. Maybe we could say that I'm extremely tan right now from sitting on the beach. But
I saw a comment of yours on Twitter about you being maybe the darkest Asian on the planet or something like that.
Yeah, you can't see it right now, but man, I've spent a lot of time floating on a surfboard out in the reef here. Not necessarily not anything that I would ever want videotaped or anything, but I have been sitting out there, and I don't really wear much sunscreen, so I've been trying to get about as dark as possible before I head back to the continental U.S.
All right. So, what are you working on?
Well, I'm just here on vacation, but still just writing a couple times a week for the New Yorker. When I get back, I started that type of pace when I was doing a newsletter, much like, John McWhorter, your very frequent collaborator on all of this. I started working at that pace a while ago. I would say maybe 2 years ago, and I found that I liked it. And so before that, I had written very long magazine pieces, and I just kind of like being able to keep up with stuff a little bit better. So that's basically what I'm working on still.
I don't know how you guys do it. My partner, John, whom I talk with here every other week, turns out a piece or more per week, 1,500 words or so at the New York Times. I don't know how you guys do
it. You kind of have to schedule your day around it. I wake up very early, I think is the key to it. So I wake up around 5:30 every day. So that's kind of how I get through it myself.
All right. Now, one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you is that I understand you've been covering the Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard University and the University of North Carolina lawsuits for years. I mean, that suit was initiated when, 2014, 2015?
Yeah.
Recently decided, momentous decision coming down from the U.S. Supreme Court, Justice Roberts writing for the majority, Justice Thomas in concurrence. 6-3 decision, Justice Sotomayor writing the primary dissenting opinion, Justice Jackson concurring. You've been writing about Asian American affairs as well throughout your career, and that figured prominently in the lawsuit. I'm wondering what do you take away from the Supreme Court's decision and from the way in which various institutions have been reacting to it?
Yeah, I mean, I started covering this, I think about 2017 or so, before they had the trial in Boston, which was the sort of federal circuit court decision. And I think when I went in, I was, just personally, at a personal level, if I thought about it, I was, hoping that Harvard would win the case, right? Journalists are objective in the way they cover it, but obviously we're people, we have thoughts ourselves. And I was sort of had a very squishy liberal sense that affirmative action was a good program because it was reparative and it was helpful, and that, these institutions probably should be more diverse, right? But I think as I reported on it more, and the case progressed and the trial went on, and you got to see more and more of the evidence, I think that it became a lot more difficult to actually co-sign the specific form in which racial preferences in elite institutions, specifically like Harvard, were being practiced. And I don't know, as a writer, I guess I found that tension where you're like, okay, everybody thinks this is one thing, right? Everyone sort of, if they're asked to describe affirmative action, would describe it in this way in which they would say something like, hey, there's a kid from Detroit, or there's a kid from the south side of Chicago, and they're descendants of slaves, and that their grandparents went through Jim Crow, their parents went through a great deal of discrimination. They themselves have gone through discrimination, and we should give them a leg up, right? Like, that's a version of affirmative action that I think many people in the United States on both sides of the political aisle would actually agree with. But, that's not how this was practiced. And I think, you have pointed out on your podcast quite a bit. You and John have talked about it a bit, like a lot, I think, right? Like, that's not what we're talking about here. And I think the more you start to realize just how much that isn't what we're talking about here, the more you start to question, or at least I did, right? I started to question, like, all right, like, is this thing supportable anymore? Or is it so corrupt? And is it so in the service of something that is not the thing that people think it is, that, like, perhaps it's not even worth supporting altogether? So that was sort of the intellectual journey that I went through over, 6-7 years.
Let me see if I understand. You're saying when you come to recognize that the beneficiaries of affirmative action, although they may be Black and Latino, are not necessarily socially disadvantaged, that they are relatively more privileged African Americans, and not necessarily, at least in the most elite colleges, the descendants of people who had been enslaved, but maybe instead descendants of African or Caribbean immigrants. That kind of soured you on affirmative action, toward which you had been favorably disposed.
Well, it didn't sour
beforehand?
me. That specifically didn't sour me on affirmative action. But when paired with the very clear evidence at Harvard and that these universities are discriminating against Asian Americans, right? Then, like, that evidence, like, I think you were convinced by it, right? I was certainly convinced by it, surprisingly, right? I went in thinking, well, I don't know, do they really do this? And then you read the evidence, you read some of the, I think you wrote an amicus brief at the beginning of this, right? You read the
I didn't
evidence.
write it.
But you signed
I
it.
signed
right?
on to it.
Right.
Yeah.
You read the evidence that comes out about stuff like, sparse country, for example, where they, like, hand out basically invitations to apply to Harvard, or they start recruiting, and how differently they treat Asian students, how they talk about them, right? You read about the personality scores and the way in which they talk about Asian students. And, like, this, by any measure, if this was any other group, this would be widely cast out as discriminatory. And so that's how I took it. I was like, this is clear discrimination. And so then when you have basically a system that discriminates against one group, right, and doesn't even accomplish really the stated goals in which its supporters think it does, then that's where you start to sour on it, right? Like, like, it seems to have done, in terms of a type of egalitarian vision that I think a lot of people want to have, it seems to have almost done more harm than good, right? I'm not talking about affirmative action in aggregate. I am just talking about the way in which it was practiced at Harvard and other elite schools. And that's when I started to be like, well, like, I don't know, like, maybe this thing, like, maybe there's not that much to defend, or maybe there's less to defend than I thought there was.
You were not convinced that the benefits of diversity outweighed some of these negative considerations?
Well, I think that if they had talked about diversity in a way that I thought was concerned, or, like, commendable, that I would have felt differently about it. If they had talked about socioeconomic diversity, if they had talked about, helping poor kids, or to try and instill some sort of class mobility. Like, there's this is an anecdote, and it happened in the courtroom, so I feel okay sharing it. But, like, I remember there's a aha moment for me where I was sitting in the courtroom, and, they were doing sort of a lot of people are coming and giving statements. A lot of Harvard students who are in favor of diversity were giving statements to the court. And this woman got up. She was a student at Harvard, and she was Latina. And she said, she told a story about how she had come to her dorm, and because of her last name, that people at the school or some of her classmates had sort of mistaken her for being her. They had assumed that her parents were housekeepers or something like that. Like, this is the way that she expressed it.
Yeah.
And for me, I was like, well, yeah, that's not great. Like, nobody wants to be miscast in that type of way, and maybe that's based on some stereotypes. But her sort of coup de grace for this story, the sort of final point of it, was she was like, little did they know my parents are doctors, And for me, and like, I was like, oh, so like this is actually just about wealthy kids, right? Um, like, what was the problem? Like, that you were offended that they thought you were poor? Like what is the source of offense here? Like, what is the problem here? And then why is it the great triumphant, which return is just like, actually, I'm just like all of you. I'm just like a rich suburban person too, right? My identity just happens to be different. And the fact that this was given as part of this sort of like, I don't know, like, I guess like a raft of narratives that were supposed to tell us why diversity was great. Like, I just found it extremely unconvincing, right? Like, and I think it actually reflects the way in which these schools think about diversity, which is like, let's try and get as many kids who went to, I don't know, like Deerfield Academy or Exeter or Choate or any of the big prep schools in New York City, and let's just try and get that group as diverse as possible. And then we can just have a diverse group of rich kids. Like, that's how this functioned for many, many years. That's how it is pursued, right? Like, for me, like, it's not a particularly compelling vision of as somebody who is far on the left, right? Like, it's just not compelling in any sort of way. And I actually find the corruption of it to be, almost unforgivable.
Unforgivable. Well, I've been saying for a long time, I tell this to my students every time I teach about affirmative action. I say, this is about elitism. And it is ensuring that you have racial diversity amongst those who are elite, but it doesn't raise any question about the pre-existing structure of elite hierarchy in the first place. It takes it as given. So how progressive could it be?
Right. If the idea is that a school in which, with Harvard, I believe there are more students in the 0.1% than the bottom 20%, right? There are more students
of the income distribution.
Of the income distribution, family income distribution. There are more students, many more students in the top 1% than in the bottom 60%, right, at Harvard, or maybe it's somewhat close. And that a school that, has been taught, like, you had the Operation Varsity Blues scandal, right, where they're just sort of handing out, to these like obscure sports that nobody plays except rich people. You have, like, I am not like that bent out of shape about legacy admissions, but it seems to be something that a lot of people are mad about, right? You have all these sorts of forms of corruption to try and ensure that the student body is as wealthy and elite as possible. And the biggest way in which they do this is that they make themselves so exclusive that only the top students and the people who can afford to sort of become, or can afford to pay their way in, get in, right? Like, how virtuous could that possibly be by adjusting the number of Black students or Latino students or Asian students by a small percentage, right? Like, there's so little, like, it's not even like rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic or anything like that. It's like literally just like, I don't know, like changing part of a paint job in a car that's like heading towards a wall or something like that, right? Like, it just doesn't make any difference to me. And so I agree with you about that. Like, I've never been able to see where the virtue is in this, and the way that it's practiced. And I think that the fact that it's almost exclusively practiced at these elite institutions, like a place like Texas A&M, for example, doesn't really have affirmative action, right? Because they don't need to. I don't know. I just found it to be such a peculiarly small and like almost like an ornate thing at this point, right? And it becomes very difficult to defend at some level.
I saw one of the lawyers who led the legal team for the Students for Fair Admissions interview. I don't remember his name. But he had an argument, and his argument was breaking it down to its basic elements. He says there are three kinds of students here that Harvard is recruiting. There are the minority students under affirmative action, the non-Asian minority students. There are the geniuses, the people with very high intellectual performance measured by test scores and so forth. And then there are the rich kids, the alumni, the legacies. So he says, it's really all about the rich kids. Everything else is in the service of taking care of the rich kids. So you need the geniuses around so that the school can maintain its reputation as a place where geniuses produce amazing intellectual contribution. You need the minority kids because you have to be on the right side of history as far as social justice is concerned. But that's the tail. The dog is the rich kids. The center of the enterprise is about cultivating this cadre of ultra elite, wealthy families, loyalty to the institution, building the endowment, and taking care of your core constituency, he says, which for a place like Harvard are the wealthy families that send their kids there.
Yeah, talking about diversity, right? Like my question is always like, well, who is the beneficiary of the diversity, right? And it is the rich kids, right? The way that they talk about it is very clear on this. They say, like, I remember that I was reading some brief, and it was about Harvard admissions officers talking about how they thought about diversity, and they're saying, well, it would be nice if, like, we imagined 3 kids sleeping in a dorm room together, right? That they had different experiences, and one of them could talk about their experiences being, for example, I don't know, let's say like for me, right, like a Korean American immigrant who was not born here in the United States, right? And one of them was like a student from Deerfield who grew up in Lexington, Massachusetts, right? And the other one was a Black student from Idaho who had grown up on a farm or something like that. And it was like, the way that this happens is that my job is to like bring a bag of kimchi to the rich kid, and to be like, hey, aren't we all great? That's why I'm here. Like, I'm here to like perform almost like a cultural theater, right? If you think about it in that sort of way, who is the person that doesn't have to perform the cultural theater in that sense, right? It's the rich kid, right? Like the rich kid is the standard there. And so, I don't know. I just find it weird to think that way, right? Like I would never try and like, I don't do that type of thing in my personal life. I hope I don't do it in my professional life. But like this whole thing where the idea is that like everybody is there to perform a diverse type of function so that the campus is vibrant in this way. Like it really feels like if you take a step back that it is all sort of in the service of the rich kids, as you said. And the best evidence for that is exactly how the Harvard admissions officers talked about it, over and over and over again, right? They would come up with these ludicrous scenarios that were all hypothetical about students sitting together or sleeping together or like sharing a room together or sitting in the library together. And the idea was always like, well, what if, like the Latino person could bring some of their Latino flavor, or the Asian person could talk about hard work. And it's just like, like this is just baseline racist stuff. And it was done over and over and over again. And the reason why was because, I think personally that there was a lot invested in sort of covering up how this system actually functioned, what it actually did, how it was discussed in these institutions, who were the beneficiaries of it. I think that colleges were very reticent to release any type of information about any of this because I think they knew at some level that like people would be like, oh, actually, that's not what I thought it was at all, and that they would lose support for it. But yeah, I don't know. Like this, do you find that to be like a conspiratorial thought?
Do I find what to be a conspiratorial
Like the idea
thought?
that the universities were invested in not telling people what they were actually doing in terms of diversity, like that they were like blocking any type of inquiry into like, for example, who were the beneficiaries of affirmative action, and that they were doing that intentionally.
Yeah, I think they were not being forthcoming about exactly what they were doing. And the evidence for that, for me, is that we didn't know how large the disparities were in likelihood of being admitted conditional on your academic qualification across the racial groups until the lawsuit forced Harvard to reveal the information. And when you saw it, as you pointed out, it was graphic. I can still remember my first time seeing this table in Peter Arcidiacono's brief, where he stratifies the applicant pool by the quality of their academic preparation. And then he looks at, if you're in the 50th percentile or the 70th or the 90th, what's your chance of getting admitted to Harvard if you're Black, if you're Asian, if you're white, if you're Latino? And it was like, order of magnitude difference. The Asian kid could be at the 80th percentile and have like a 6% chance of getting admitted compared to 30 or 40% chance of getting admitted if a Black kid with the same portfolio. So yeah, they weren't exactly forthcoming. Conspiratorial, well, dishonest,
Yeah.
not straightforward for sure. But no, a lot of Asian kids supported the university in its effort to avoid those, you know, repercussions of the student for fair admission lawsuit. How so?
Well, I think that they're people, and I think that they're well intentioned, and I think, and maybe they're right, right? That they feel that, even if they feel that a place like Harvard, I remember I spoke to a Harvard student when I started doing my reporting, and she said, it's very difficult to have to choose between Harvard, the institution, and Ed Blum, who is the lawyer or not the lawyer, the legal activist who brought this lawsuit, right? And that, she felt that in aggregate, that perhaps it would be better to have affirmative action, to not have this thing struck down. And I think in some ways, and although she didn't say this, I imagine she might feel this way. And some other students I spoke to did feel this way and did express it explicitly, which is that they worried that a sense of racial solidarity, the idea of like people of color, for example, right, would be disrupted by something like this, right? That Asians, I don't know, if you study any type of Asian American history, or at least the sort of academic discussions about Asian American history, you come across this idea of like Asian Americans being used as a wedge, right? Like to separate, to be placed in between Black and white communities, and or whatever, this idea of the model minority. And that they felt that this lawsuit, even if they did agree that Harvard was probably discriminating against them, that the destruction from being used in this type of way, right, to end affirmative action effectively at these schools, that was more harmful, And I think if the good faith and I think the generous interpretation of this would say that, and I do think that many people, most of the people who are opposed to us, felt this way specifically. And then I think some people, just are kind of locked into whatever side they're on, right, and they wanted to be on the progressive side. Right. But I think for a lot of people who gave it a lot of thought, I think it was that. It was this idea of like, can we actually disrupt the people of color coalition? And dare we? Like that. I think it was that type of thinking.
Dare we less what? What are the alternative? What's the negative consequence of disrupting? Not to be accepted as a member in good standing of the progressive pantheon of American society? I'm guessing.
I think so. Yeah, I think that's what it is. I think I've written a lot about this. I think ultimately it ends up being somewhat of a class issue, right? I live in, for example, I was not born in the United States. I grew up in North Carolina, but I live now in Berkeley, California. Before that, I lived in Brooklyn, right? Everyone that I worked at the New York Times and now I work at the New Yorker, the vast majority of the people that I interact with in any given day are progressive, wealthy progressives, right? Very highly educated. That's true of most Asian people who go through elite schooling like I did. And I think that basically it's your social position is at stake in some ways if you come out and you're against some of these things. I think a lot of people who are in the academy are very invested in the idea of an identity politics that does that does have a type of idea of people of color solidarity. I think for the academics, that is at risk if you come out against this. And I think that there is just a lot of fear that those types of ideas would be dismantled and broken down. And I don't know. I don't think that it was a crazy thought that those people felt that way, but I just, I don't know. I think it just required them to overlook the clear discrimination that was happening against their own people, which I just found to be like Like, I'm not beholden to any of those things. And so for me, the only thing is to just point out, hey, this is clear discrimination. Um, and the other stuff I don't really care about. I do care about like the idea of solidarity and whatever, but I'm much more cynical about the idea that like, the academic people of color coalition actually matters to the vast majority of Americans, including the people of those identities that they're trying to protect. I think it's almost a separate thing, right? So, yeah, for me, it was just, this is clear discrimination and, that's weird.
You described yourself as far left. Did I get that right?
Yeah, well, economically, much like your, yes, I voted for Bernie Sanders. I don't know maybe that's the best way to put
So
it.
then I just want to get your reaction as a man of the left to the culture argument. I can make a culture argument about what's wrong in inner city, low income African American communities with the violence and school failure and broken families and things like that. And I could make a culture argument in the spirit. I don't know if you know the book, The Asian American Achievement Paradox by Jennifer Lee and Min
Sure.
Zhou. They interview Asian families in Southern California, and they make, I don't know if they don't up to it, but I read the book, and what I saw was a culture argument about families and values and norms and expectations and whatever. Is it okay? Is it kosher to make culture arguments, either with respect to those lagging behind or with those who are doing exceptionally well, on the left, in your view?
Well, I think it depends on the cultural arguments you make, but I do agree with you that there are people who I think would be squeamish about the idea of making a cultural argument who are in fact making a cultural argument, right? So, for example, there was a book put out recently about the suburbs and Asian achievement in the suburbs, right? And I think this specific suburb was like a suburb of Boston, Lexington, Massachusetts, right? Which is a very wealthy, educated suburb that has a large Asian population now. And
I
that
know it well.
the argument was basically that was made if you read it without knowing how to read it, I think you would just assume that this was a cultural argument and saying that the Asian families care more about things like Russian math, for example, and that the white families care about sports, right? Which is true, right? Like I think probably in that community that like the 3 hours that a lot of the white kids in those types of suburbs do playing soccer or whatever, the Asian kids are going to violin and math, and that's why by the time they reach high school, they have an advantage, right? Like for Lexington, there's not very many Black or Latino students. And so, like the idea was of the book, though, was that like this has created a type of resentment in white suburbs that have large Asian populations of the Asian achievement. But this is why the Asian achievement exists, and this is why it's flourished. The argument made is basically a cultural one. But I don't know if the author would own up to that or the author would say it was a cultural argument. So I think that's just a long way of saying I think that progressives tend to make more cultural arguments than they think or will at least admit to. Now, whether or not they'll tag them as that, I generally think that they wouldn't. But I do think that a lot of these arguments are essentially cultural arguments, right? Like look at the way in which the California math curriculum, for example, was discussed, right? Like, and the introduction of algebra in middle school, the way in which like Joe Bowaller and the other authors of that report put it, it was a cultural argument, right? Like that was a cultural argument. They wouldn't say it was. They would say it was a cultural argument for good. But I don't know. That was a cultural argument. That
Why
was an
don't you
argument
explain to
left.
people who might not know exactly what was recommended by the
Oh yeah.
California
Well, it
report?
was to try and get rid of tracking in math in middle school so that kids could all sort of learn math at the same pace. And that in the earlier versions of the draft, which caused great stir and which has been edited, but it passed. The idea was basically that you wouldn't teach algebra in middle school. You would start a type of, I don't know, almost comprehensive math. But what the casualty of this would be that like high school students would not be able to take calculus, right? And that the arguments that they made were essentially, I don't know, a sort of standard identity type of equity arguments saying, well, Black and Latino students struggle in these environments that, because of whatever household things or whatever societal things, they think of, they, at early ages, they start to not think of themselves as, quote, math people, right? And that white and Asian students don't have a problem thinking of themselves as, quote, math people because, like, factors in the home or because they're encouraged in a different type of way. And that the solution to this is to just basically keep everyone together until one can identify that they are a math person or not a math person, right? Which might be in the 7th grade. But if you start separating kids by ability as early as the 1st and 2nd grade, then the kids who are in the lower half of the distribution will never think of themselves as math students, and that's too early to do that. That's the whole argument, I think. That's also, like, in my mind, a cultural argument, right? Like, that they're making.
Has there been pushback specifically from, quote, the Asian community, close quote, in California on this development?
Oh yeah, for sure. I think the activation of the Asian community over the past 10 years is something I've been very interested in, politically speaking, right? In New York City, you saw it around Stuyvesant, Bronx Science.
Loury Chin.
In the Bay Area, you saw it around Lowell High School, which is the high school in San Francisco, which is similar to Stuyvesant. And then you saw it around the school board, right? School board recall. And then you saw it in in a strange way, in the recall of Chesa Bodine, the district attorney in San Francisco at the time. But in the end, the activation does come down to times in which they feel like local or state governments are impinging upon, what they see as like a meritocratic education system that they, tend to do quite well in. And so, yeah, they've been very mad. They've been pretty mad about the math curriculum stuff. Yeah, for sure.
So you think the People of Color Coalition isn't robust enough to accommodate Black, Latino, and Asian interests?
Well, it depends where you like. I don't.
Common enemy. The Trump
Yeah, I don't think so.
MAGA.
I don't think that. I don't think that's rooted in reality. I think that these, even within the Asian community, there's something I write about quite a bit too. Is like, there's no real Asian America. Like, what does it mean? Like, there's no Asian. I'm Korean. I know I have some Chinese friends, right? We have pretty little in common in terms of the way that we were brought up, and we don't speak the same language. We don't eat the same foods, right? Like, we are friends in some ways because, if somebody walks down the street and says, there's an Asian person, then, we both be picked out. But we don't really, like, there's not really a strong cultural bond there. And then to extend that out to the idea that, like, all of us non-white people it's not that theoretically there is not something shared there, right? Like, you could say, like, we share resistance to white supremacy or something like that, right? Like, sounds okay. But I don't know. I know a lot of Asian people, I know a lot of Latino people, I know a lot of Black people as well, and I just, outside of like the academic circles, I don't see that type of expression ever. I see groups of people who are culturally bound together for whatever reason, language, food, country of origin, and that they tend to, mostly not think of themselves outside of that group and not as some huge coalition. And so, yeah, I'm extremely skeptical about that type of idea and the way in which, like, identity is leveraged and created in different moments to try and give a type of political power to an idea that, might not have the actual support that people say it does.
Mm. My son, Nehemiah, my youngest of my 5 children, is getting married in October to a Chinese American woman. They met at Columbia, your alma mater. And um, I'm looking forward to getting to know her family better. And, we're blurring the various identity lines here through intermarriage, which is a good thing, isn't it?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I'm somewhat agnostic on that, but Yeah. Hey, I have a question for you. Is that okay?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. You know, I've listened to your podcast quite a bit, and I remember years ago, maybe it's not years ago, but a while back, I remember I don't remember who it was you were talking to, but it wasn't John, but you were talking about a moment in which I think it was Norman Potteretz had asked you to write a cover story for Comment or whatever, right? Like about, and that it was going to be the magazine's big statement against affirmative action, and that you told him that you couldn't, right? Do you remember telling the story? No. Oh, and that
No, what I remember was back in the 90s, as the California ballot proposition 209 was
right.
coming to fruition. And I was associated with something called the Center for New Black Leadership, which was a conservative leaning Black think tank trying to promote social policy ideas that were center right, and was friendly with the relatively newly confirmed Justice Clarence Thomas. He was a booster of the Center for New Black Leadership, and had people like Ariana Huffington, Shelby Steele, and others of that ilk associated with it. And I was involved, and I demurred about going out to California and campaigning openly for ballot proposition 209, saying that while I was not unsympathetic to Wirt Connerly and company, the people who were trying to get affirmative action banned in California, I thought that if we wanted to cultivate good relations with people in the Black community more broadly, we shouldn't be leading with an anti-affirmative action crusade as our first, you know, step out of the box. And I got vociferously denounced for my equivocation, and I ended up resigning as chairman of that group because I was out of step with the sentiment of the board. And, you know, that was the beginning of my shifting to the left a little bit from my uh, Black conservative number one. See, I've been a conservative, then I was kind of a center left guy. Now I'm a conservative again. So, and I shifted around in the mid 90s, late 90s from the conservative a little bit more to the left. But I'm back in place now.
Well, I guess the reason I asked is because I think what you were expressing and was that there is a you know, that this is an issue that has such deep emotional uh, resonance, and such that there's such an emotional attachment to this, to affirmative action generally, that it is difficult to criticize, right? Or it's difficult to even, you know, as you said, sort of, if you want to convince people that like this is not the drum to beat, right? Do you think that's still true?
Not as true, certainly not people broadly. If I spoke of Blacks, I think, I don't know what the poll numbers are exactly, 70-30 or something like that, supporting affirmative action. It depends on what you mean and how you phrase the question, but support among Blacks. But uh, outside of Blacks, I don't think there's a majority support for affirmative action anywhere in the polling data. Again, it depends on how you ask the question.
Were you
Um,
surprised by like a lack of like, I guess I only think about it because I felt this way, and I wanted to ask you this. It's just like I was actually surprised by the lack of outrage at the decision when it came down. I felt like there would be now, of course, there was, right? Like people wrote and people expressed it, but it was far more muted than I thought it would be. And even in the week leading up to the decision, I felt like it would be a constant flow of arguments, basically saying this is going to happen and this is why it's bad. And you know, as somebody who's worked in the media a long time and pays attention to it, you know, I generally have a decent sense, I think, of like the volume of things and the appropriateness of it, right? Or whether it's really a priority for the people who are writing or the people who run, for example, like the New York Times, or New Yorker or wherever, all these places that I've worked. And I just felt like it was smaller than I thought it was going to be. I don't know. How did you feel about that?
yeah, I expected there to be some civil disturbance, actually.
Right.
I thought there might be people in the streets marching in protest against the court. I thought there could have been political mobilization of the sort that you saw after the Dobbs decision on abortion, uh, in which people we're making a big deal out of this as yet another move by a conservative court, delegitimizing the court. And you do hear some of that, but you don't hear nearly as much of it as you could be hearing. You don't hear anything close to what you heard after the abortion decision. So I think you have a point. And the question then becomes why?
Yeah. I don't know. I don't know I mean, I don't really have a theory on it. I'm wondering if you did. Like, because I
Well,
guess, yeah, go ahead.
no, I was going to say because the underlying predicate is very hard to defend.
Right.
As you outlined at the beginning of this conversation about what Harvard was doing in the case at hand, but it's kind of hard to defend. It's not right at the core of anything. This is on the surface of things, it seems to me. Most kids are going to colleges where affirmative action is not practiced at all because the
Right.
colleges are admitting pretty much everybody who applies. Um, you know, Roberts, I found Roberts' opinion to be absolutely crystal clear. He says, you say this is for diversity and for creating a leadership cadres that'll be more effective and more representative. But how would I ever actually measure that? How would I gauge whether or not you're achieving those objectives? It's very unclear how I can subject your claims of the compelling interests that are being advanced here to judicial review. He says, it's not supposed to be a negative. It's only supposed to be a positive, but it's a zero sum situation where you admit some and you don't admit others. And clearly it is a negative for the Asians. So it's not consistent with the legal framework that we've set out for these cases. He says, as we've said here, you're reducing kids to being representatives of these abstract categories as opposed to being individual persons, which is an essential stereotyping activity that's also inconsistent with the framework that we've set out here. And finally, he said, uh, this is not something that we can be doing forever. Sandra Day O'Connor, 25 years and all of that. And yet, I see no end in sight for what you're doing. I see no even anticipation that there would be an end to what you're doing. So, for all those reasons, I I found that to be pretty compelling. So maybe other people did as well.
Do you, have you, you've been in the academy for a while, and it's, obviously for a very long period of time. Like, the one thing that has always, the part that concerns me the most is this idea in which people feel like they have to perform a type of harm, right? And so for myself, for example, I think about it and I think, well, okay, I can sort of construct one, right? Like I can say, my parents were born in a war zone in Korea, right? This is true, right? My family escaped from North Korea. That's true, right? I have generational trauma from Japanese imperialism and from my parents being born in a war zone. I mean, it should be true, right? When I was a child, I lived in I don't know, I'm sure you're very familiar with Cambridge, but our family lived in the Alewife Towers.
I know the Ringe Towers. I read this in your book.
Right,
I read about this.
Yeah.
No, wait a minute. My estranged wife, I was married coming to graduate school with 2 kids, and we split up while in graduate school when I was at MIT. And they moved my wife and 2 kids to the Ringe Towers that you talk about. So I know them very well.
So you know them, yeah. So my point is just I could come up with this whole sort of history of oppression for myself, and do I believe it? No, by the time I was in middle school, my family was very middle class, right? And my parents were very educated. And so it's not like, and I guess I fear that what happens is that when students are incentivized to this degree to perform something like that, that they start to believe it, that they feel like the difference between going to Harvard and going to I don't know, a perfectly fine but not Harvard school is that they have to construct this type of identity around themselves. And that if, the way in which Harvard was doing it for a while was basically if you didn't write about it in your essay, it didn't count, right? Like it didn't count that you were this minority group unless you told a sob story about it. I find that to be totally indefensible. Actually, I find it to be quite disgusting, right? That this elite institution is asking these kids to perform their trauma stories for them. But as you've witnessed in the past 20, 30 years, however long that this type of story has been asked to be told, have you noticed that the students themselves have started to imbue it more? Do you think it has an effect on the way in which the students think about themselves? Or do you think it's just something that they do once and they just say, okay, it helped me get into Harvard and now I'm just going to stop? Yeah.
I don't know. That's a question for a psychologist or somebody. I mean, I I see the danger in what you say, and I have seen the performance that you make reference to. How systematic the embrace of this performative, internalization. I've been victimized. I am harmed. I am diminished. Uh, how widespread that is, I'd only be guessing if I said anything. I do think it's debilitating uh, and disempowering, uh, and also it's a lie.
Right.
I mean, it's untrue to the actual objective condition of the mostly solidly upper middle class Black kids that I encounter here in my classes at Brown. They haven't exactly been beaten down by history, notwithstanding the fact that they will be able to recount both in their own lives and in the lives of their parents and grandparents a wealth of stories about disadvantage and mistreatment. You know, but they're very very privileged kids, frankly.
Yeah, I think for the Asian population, like maybe that was part of the angst that was going along, or like for a lot of the parents of the kids who are applying to these schools, right? That um, they were told stuff like, "Don't tell the immigrant story because they don't, like they don't care about that," And it's like I think that when you have, like Robert said, like if there's a positive, there has to be a negative here. That there was almost this, I think, for a lot of the students and their parents that I spoke to, this belief that, hey man, like it's not great to be from, like what happened if you're Vietnamese and you live in America, like you probably have some generational trauma like somewhere nearby. you know right, like if you are from Korea, same thing, right? Like there's like something that happened that was bad, that if people who didn't know about it saw photos of, they would be shocked. Like if you saw the poverty in Seoul when my parents were growing up, for example, you would be shocked. I was shocked when I first saw it, and that
Yeah.
there's this idea that I think that, and the thing that I think frustrated a lot of people, which is just like, look, nothing that happened to my family or me or whatever matters, but then you have like, for example, let's say like, like a Chilean kid coming who grew up extremely wealthy, and like that matters more, right? Like that he gets to check the Latino box, and so then like within that type of atmosphere where those things are true and are happening, then how do you support it? And I think that that was sort of falling off point for a lot of these Asian families, and I don't know. I would just say personally for myself too. Where I was just like, this just doesn't make any sense, right? Like like the grandson of somebody who worked with Milton Friedman, to like, deregulate the economy of that country and is a billionaire, is so like that identity matters, right? But like this like poor Chinese kid who, or like poor Vietnamese kid, poor Cambodian kid, like that doesn't matter, like doesn't matter what happened to this family. It doesn't matter all these different things. It actually just matters that this kid can check the Latino box and we can't. Like that's like not a good system, I think, for anyone. But I think it's, particularly on the left, because it almost makes a mockery of all the things that like we're supposed to care about, right? Like it makes a mockery of the egalitarian ideas that should be fueling a lot of these ideas. And I think that, supporting it is, I don't know, I think it's silly.
I was struck in reviewing some of your essays in The Loneliest American by the concern that you had of during the COVID-19 pandemic of anti-Asian backlash. And I wanted to ask which would affect people who are not necessarily Chinese, since you know, a person might not be subtle enough in their perceptions to make the distinctions. But uh, there's a lot of talk about China, about the uh, confrontation or conflict or contestation between the U.S. and China and so forth. And I wondered, from your perspective, how you perceive the bellicosity and ferocious character of some of the anti-Chinese rhetoric that we hear, and uh, what you might think that means for the uh, political and social situation of Asian Americans more broadly.
Well, I don't think it'll be good for, I don't think a sort of heightened Cold War would be good for Asian Americans generally, right? And I do think that that is one place where I would acknowledge that like some idea of Asian Americanness exists, right? Because, um, like you said, if someone sees me and thinks that and is mad at a Chinese person, it's not like they're gonna ask, right? like, um, and so, but at the same time, I have started to believe, and I think that I'm correct about this. I'm curious about your opinion about it, which is that basically what we have is a cordon off anger, right? That the idea that the United States economy can decouple itself from China, I think, is ludicrous at this point. I think a lot of people have started to understand that. And
Yeah.
that whatever sort of political rage that people want to direct and say China this, China that, like it's not going to get the sort of traction that I think people want it to. And I think that in fact it's been dying down quite a bit. Like if you remember, like when Joe Biden was running in 2020, like he had a couple ads that were like very explicitly anti-China, right? Like none of that exists anymore. It's 3 years later. Like we haven't heard him say a word about any of this stuff, right? Um, you had like Tim Ryan run against JD Vance, right? And a pretty like he was like, well, I'm the Democrat who says China's bad, right? And it's like he lost and nobody really cared about that issue. And I really think that basically what has happened is that like everyone has kind of looked around post pandemic because at that point, I think because China was obviously in such disarray that they thought maybe we can just decouple. And that like, the people who make these decisions kind of were like, no, we can't, And so I imagine that a lot of this anti-China rhetoric is going to go down, because I think that the sort of business interests here in the United States have realized that like we can't actually have a bad relationship with China or else our economy will collapse. And I don't know. That generally is what matters, right? Like it's not like three politicians screaming all the time that matters, or at least someone will pay them to like not say that stuff anymore, right? So I don't know. That seems to be at least that's my assessment of it.
Yeah. Well, you're certainly right about the entailment, about the extent to which the economies are so um, closely intertwined that severe disruption in trade between the two countries would have catastrophic effects downstream. I think that's clear. So you're in Hawaii, but you're just visiting.
Yeah. I'm visiting my sister and my nephew for a month. Yeah.
I, I'm going to ask a very ridiculously broad question, but do you discern noticeable differences in the character of race relations
yeah.
in the Hawaiian Islands than one would see in the Bay Area, California, or whatever?
Yeah. I'll just tell a story about it. I mean, I surf, and so the other and obviously in Hawaii, everybody like I think this is maybe people don't know this, but there's a strict localism around surf breaks, right? Like there's each surf break is kind of protected by a cadre of locals that go out and kind of are all friends. They all grew up together. Some of them have been surfing these breaks for like 40, 50 years. And the way that they keep sort of newcomers or tourists off it is that they act extremely hostile, right, towards them. And so yesterday I was out at one near where we are right now, and I was there with my sister who goes out to that break a lot and I think has been kind of embraced in some ways by the locals, but they didn't know that I was her brother, and they were totally nice to me. All these people would, if they were walking around San Francisco or something like that, would be classified as Asian, right? And and I asked my sister, I was like, well, it doesn't seem so bad here. The locals, they all said hi to me, and she was like, oh, it's because they think you're Hawaiian, If you were white, they would have chased you off, And so, yeah, in some ways, yes, it's very different, Like I think it was one of the first times I think I've been like positively discriminated for, even if it was a mistake, right? And so, yeah, at least in the short time that I've been around here. Now, obviously, real power relations, et cetera, like are different. You can criticize however you want, right? But I think on an interpersonal level, like it's very strange for me to be here, right? It's it's almost like being in Asia, at least in Honolulu, right? Like in some ways, it's almost like being in Asia, but everybody, speaks English, use American currency, et cetera, et cetera. Um, and I don't know. I guess I just don't see many white people here, right? I see a lot of I'm in the city of, I think if I went down to Waikiki or something like that, it would be a little bit different. But
Mm.
yeah, it's very different, right? And I actually don't understand it. Like I don't understand the racial dynamics here, except in the way that I like experience them. Like I don't know that much about Hawaiian history. I don't understand why this is happening. But I think basically because I kind of look Hawaiian that, I've treated as such, which has been interesting.
Well, okay. Got anything else on your mind?
No, I was gonna ask you, like what did I've been curious. I wanted to know specifically like what you think the schools or I guess the first question I was just like, do you think that there's gonna be a discernible dip in the number of Black and Latino students at these elite institutions following this decision? Like, do you think it's going to actually, do you think it'll be like California where, at UCLA and at Cal, you had like an actual drop in Black students, or do you think it's basically just going to kind of stay the same?
I think there's going to be an effort to keep it the same, but that's costly. And institutions will vary in the extent to which they're willing to pay that cost. So we're going to probably see at least a small downward tick pretty much everywhere amongst the uber elite campuses, but maybe more some places than others. Um, I think, we've already seen the movement to abandon the standardized test as a requirement for application. And um, that's part of what I mean by being costly, because of course you can avoid that information, but if you don't use that information, you select a different set of young people, and you're doing that not only for the minority groups that you're trying to preserve, but you're doing that across the board, and has implications for the character of the institution more broadly. So um, I, there's the effort to rely on essays and the hardship Olympics that's invited of people to demonstrate their uh, character and fortitude by having overcome this or that racial impediment. I expect we'll see some of that. Uh, what we won't see is the kind of thing that you allude to in your comment in the New Yorker recently that I just was looking at, of significantly expanded class sizes, of the abandonment of the recruiting channels from the elite prep schools where the Ivies would take a substantial portion of their class from those feeder schools, a expansion of the number of community college transfers that could be recruited into elite campuses, and that would be more diverse. Uh, a Roland Fryer, I don't know if you saw it in the
Yeah, I did.
op-ed
Yeah.
piece in the Times, take some of the endowment money and create academies,
Right.
scores of them across the country that could identify and then cultivate youngsters early on from, eighth, ninth, 10th grade so that they'd be ready to compete effectively for admission to a place like Harvard. I doubt that we'll see that. I wish that we would. But my answer is, yeah, you're going to see a downward tick. If it's 15% at Harvard, I don't see how it can 15% Black at Harvard. I don't see how they could sustain that and also be consistent with what the court has required.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the universities will use proxy systems, right? And I guess my question is, how quickly do those get sued, right? Like, and how quickly do those get subject to lawsuit? And so, if every proxy system then gets sued, like I don't know if you saw, for example, at the University of at Cal, right, the law school. the dean of the law school just came out and basically said, yeah, we look when hiring at race. We're not allowed to, but we just don't say anything, right? We don't say it
I
out
didn't see
loud.
that.
Oh yeah. He sort of gave away the game.
The
Everyone
dean
knows.
said out loud that we don't say this out loud.
Yeah. We all, everyone knows that this is happening, right? That's why there was a frustrating conversation that was happening where people are saying well, California doesn't even have affirmative action, so how could this Asian student be discriminated against, right? And I was like, they do, they just use proxies and they never say the words, right? Or else, but obviously there's some diversity, there's some sort of finger on the scale to achieve the diversity they want. And the reason it is because there are people whose job it is to do this, right? And they're very proud of it. Maybe they should, as I think arguably they should be, right? I don't think it's good for a state university in California to have 1 or 2% Black students, right? So
Sure.
there are people there who are given that job to sort of do that, but none of them can talk about it. And so you have this sort of the dean of the Cal Law School sort of saying, hey, we do this, but we don't say it. I imagine they're going to get sued, right? Someone's going to sue them, right? Because of that. And the proxy is that it's going to, at the very least, it's going to be used as evidence in other lawsuits that say all these proxies are effectively doing the thing that that's illegal now. And so I think that the effectiveness, go ahead.
There's a statistical point, which is, if you go to the proxy, put more weight on essays than less on test scores, or use geographic designations and, create different admissions policies based on farm or city or poor part of the city or whatever. There, does it statistically have the effect of advancing the proportion of the class that's Black? So that's one question. But another question is, was that the intent? Did they do it in order to have that effect?
Right.
And you have to kind of discriminate between those two things. I mean, just because it had the effect of enhancing Black presence in the class doesn't, on that alone, make it unconstitutional. But if it were to have had that effect as a matter of the design, as a workaround, an indirect way of doing racial discrimination, then I assume the court would look askance at that. But I don't know. We're going to have more cases, that's for sure, and not just in higher education. I just saw a story today about states attorneys general in Republican states warning Fortune 100 companies that their personnel practices and their hiring programs, where they announced publicly that they're going to make a special effort to enhance the racial diversity of their workforce, could come under scrutiny as well as a result of this. So we're in a different world, it would appear.
Yeah, it was hard for me to even, not as someone who's not trained legally, to try and figure out how broad that decision was, the one that was written. I think there are some ways to interpret it as saying it was pretty narrow. For example, right, the sort of carve out for military academies and stuff like that, right? It could be read as pretty narrow, but I think it just depends on how they interpret it down the line in terms of this other stuff, right? And how broad it is. But I think it was still, regardless of however you felt, a bit narrower than people were catastrophizing about, right? Or that they felt like could be possible. Nobody even said Grutter is overturned. Roberts didn't. Clarence Thomas did, right? It wasn't like the sort of slam the door decision that I think people interpreted the Dobbs decision to be, for example.
Well, I thought on the military academy carve out that it was entirely consistent with the logic of Roberts' opinion. Because what the military academies are saying is we have to keep good order and discipline in the ranks, and we can't have a racial imbalance where the officers are mostly white guys and the enlisted people are disproportionately Black and brown. We have experience in the concrete history of the military in which this has been a problem, and we need to take steps in order to avert that problem. Then they describe the steps that they take. But that's doing exactly what Roberts said in the first part of his opinion that the practice at Harvard doesn't do, which is clearly specifically and measurably identifying what the benefits are from the diversification of the upper ranks by race, those benefits being the maintenance of order and discipline within the organization overall. And that's not something that a big university can lay claim to. That's how I read that. I read it. Military is a special case because it's a well-contained system in which we can assess the concrete benefits from the diversification that you guys are pursuing.
Did Do you not see any of that in that, in your classroom or, in your job? Where do you feel like that if the diversity falls, for example, at Brown, that the quality of the education and also your experience as faculty will be harmed?
If we went down to 1 or 2%, yeah. If we went from 15 or 13% to 8 or 10%, not so much. But yeah, I was just teaching a class at the University of Austin, which is this new startup
Sure.
university, free speech university that's trying to get going. I did a summer class. It was on race and inequality in America. There were 20 very able students from all over the world who were in the class. 2 of them were Black. The affirmative action case came down on the Thursday of the week that I was teaching, a Monday through Friday, 3 hours a day marathon seminar. And one of the African American participants in this seminar said, "Imagine what this discussion would look like and feel like if we weren't here," referring to herself and her colleague who was also African American. And I had to acknowledge, and notwithstanding my misgivings about affirmative action and my general support for the Supreme Court's decision, she had a pretty good point. It would have been a completely different discussion of
Right.
the case in the absence of African Americans. It would have been different even as the non-Black kids talked among themselves, because the presence of the Black kids, in a way, conditioned and disciplined the conversation amongst the non-Black kids about it. They had to know that the things that they were saying were being heard by people about whom they were talking, and
Right.
that would affect the way they talked about them. This is not always good, but it's different, and different in a way that I think I wouldn't want to try to teach a class about race and racial inequality in the United States without some Black students in the room. That would
Yeah.
not be an ideal arrangement.
But so there's like some threshold where you feel like some intervention is okay, or is it really just that you feel like maybe without intervention the numbers will be sufficient?
So I could talk like an economist or I could talk like a lawyer. So the lawyer is going to say, what does the Constitution say and what does it
Right.
prohibit? And, never mind. The economist is going to say how much. It's going to say 2%, 3%, 5%, 7%. It wouldn't be a black and white. It would be a question of the relative merits of a little bit more, a little bit less. And at that, in that register, in the register of a little bit more, a little bit less, I would say, yeah, zero affirmative action is not as good as a little bit of affirmative action.
Yeah.
But a little bit of affirmative action for Clarence Thomas is like a little bit of pregnancy. It doesn't make any sense. The law is the law. It prohibits racial discrimination. The Constitution is colorblind. That's the end of the discussion.
Yeah, I guess like from my perspective, I think that I agree with the woman in your classroom, right? Which is that I do think that that type of conversation is very different, and that there's an educational benefit for everybody involved, right? That it doesn't sort of become one group just sort of airing grievances. In this case, it was just white students saying, "Oh yeah, like they get all the breaks and we don't," right? Like that's not an educational process, right? That's just people complaining. But I just think that within the structure of elite institutions, it's almost impossible to create any type of uh, to create that type of conversation anyway. Because what you're dealing with is you're just dealing with, like we talked about at the beginning, it's just wealthy kids, right? Like that is the main identity of people who go to these institutions, is that they're wealthy, right? Like that's the most consistent identity of that's out there. And that, for me, it's like the question of whether or not that type of education, there's educational benefit to that type of, within that type of context of having people who, are of different racial identities. I feel like it almost doesn't matter. Right? Like it's almost academic, I guess. Now, if you could expand these institutions or even get rid of them and sort of reinvest in community colleges or whatever, I feel like then the diversity part is just sort of going to happen on itself, right? Like it does at large universities that take most of the applicants that apply. Like I don't think that they have this problem where they would say, like I don't think at Texas A&M, for example, if you taught a class, I'm only using it because it's like a very large university. If you taught a class about race, that you would almost never have a problem where you didn't have Black students in that class, right? Like that would not be a problem. And I guess I just hope that people will think more of those types of models in which you don't have to even entertain any of these questions, right? And I don't quite know why they're so or why that type of thinking is not more common amongst people on the left in America, right? Like, why do they accept the existence of the Ivy Leagues? Like, why do they accept the existence of Stanford? When, like, right across the border in Canada, we have a country that doesn't really have those types of schools, right? They have big public universities that are, pegged to whatever province that you're from. And,
Yeah.
like, does it seem so foreign? Does it seem so outrageous that's a system out there? Then I guess I just never have understood why liberals and progressives don't, make that type of argument. Why instead they feel like, sort of juggling little bits of statistics at elite institutions is actually virtuous.
Well, for the private institutions, they're private. I asked this question the last time I was talking about this with John McWhorter. I say Harvard has a $50 billion plus endowment. Whose money is that? Who does it belong to?
Yeah, that's a good question. I actually don't know who. Yeah, can you tell me? Like, yeah,
this private nonprofit entity
right.
is this corporation that has been chartered and is a legal entity. Controls those resources on behalf of the mission of the philanthropy. It's like it's a little small foundation. It's
right.
Engaged in research, education, and cultural, betterment. The trustees are responsible for managing it, but it's a private philanthropy.
Right.
So.
Right.
They can make themselves a club for the rich if they want to. Their endowment doesn't belong to the U.S. Government to be parsed out this way or that. I mean, they might lose standing and their brand might be tarnished, but I don't see any legal constraint that binds them to to further the social objectives of this or that political faction within the society.
Yeah, I agree with that. I do think, at some point Donald Trump started talking about taxing these endowments, right, higher than they are. And he kind of got some through, but at a very small scale. And I do wonder what it would look like with very steep endowment tax, right? Right? If I don't know, somebody like, let's say, Elizabeth Warren started pushing for that, right? But I don't know. I think that part of the frustration of being on the progressive side of things is that you kind of know that Elizabeth Warren is never going to go after Harvard, and that's why a lot of these things persist. That's why these places have such cultural power, which is that like progressive politician can talk about every bad corporation in America that they think is bad. But when it comes to these places where elitism and exclusivity are fostered and where the next elite come from, right, they won't say a word because they went to those schools or they taught at those schools themselves, right? And, I don't know. I think that needs to change quite drastically. And, but, I'm not going to convince anyone. I can just say it, but nobody listens to me about this stuff.
Well, I wouldn't say no one's listening. I'm listening. I'm sure I'm not alone. And in any case, something tells me you're not going to stop saying it, whether I'm listening or not. So,
Oh, man.
So listen, Jay, thanks a lot for joining the conversation here at the Glenn Show. I appreciate it. And, you know, good luck to you in your future endeavors.
Okay, thank you. I'll talk to you at some point.
All right. Take care now.